Hi, everybody. You're all very welcome. This is the last in our series of the road to COP26 with Instinctif Partners. And just as it's the last time, currently, we hope with Instinctif Partners, that we hope to join up with them again, just to thank them for their generosity in sponsoring this series, and to Lucy particularly in participating. So thank you very much for those. We've deliberately chosen tougher topics when it comes to decarbonisation, because we want to be the forum for informed debate and discussion on these, because all of society and business has to come together to try and solve these issues, and some of them aren't easy. So you'll recall 2 weeks ago we had a seminar on decarbonisation and the transport sector, and clearly there's some easy wins, but there are also a large number of longer term items that we need to try and solve. On this one, I think this seminar, I think we've got an equally challenging topic in relation to the agri-food sector, particularly in Ireland. And again, we want to be the forum for informed debate in relation to these topics, because they need to be solved, and they need to be solved in a just and even-handed way, such that everybody can prosper. It's not about penalizing one sector of society over another. It's about finding solutions for the long term. So just the format of this morning is that I will hand over shortly to Catherine Coffey. As always, he'll just go through the logistics of the event. Then we'll hear from Mr. Minister McConalogue, Minister for Agriculture, Food and Marine, and then we'll hand over to Professor John Sweeney, who leads the Irish Climate Analysis and Research Unit, and then we've got finally we'll have a panel session chaired by Lucy Cronin from Instinctif Group. So really looking forward to this morning's conversation, and beginning to sort of have that informed debate around trying to solve these issues, which are so important for everybody. If I can, and without further ado, I'll turn to Minister McConalogue to give his speech. So, Minister McConalogue, I noticed when you were being appointed by Micheál Martin, he called you a proud son of Inishowen and Donegal. So, looking forward to hearing from you this morning, Minister.
Thank you very much, Mark. And listen, it's a pleasure to be joining you this morning, and thanks very much the invitation to speak with the British Irish Chamber of Commerce about climate challenge from an agricultural perspective. And while obviously the COVID-19 pandemic still lingers here and indeed around the world, we can't lose sight of other challenges. And indeed the climate challenge is certainly one that remains very much in firm focus, both for me personally and for this government as well. The agri-food sector, as you know, is Ireland's most important indigenous industry, and playing a vital role in our economy and indeed the fabric of our rural communities and society. It's the bedrock very much of every rural village across the country. The sector itself is dominated very much by livestock. We have 80% of our agricultural area under permanent grassland, and that underpins a world famous really grass-based production system, producing beef and dairy products that are exported then to over 180 countries around the world. The sector overall accounts for 8% of all employment and 10% of all exports, and that leaves Ireland very much agri-food based. And the sector is significant as well, a driver of economic activity across rural Ireland. The sustainability of our food production system is well recognised internationally, and acts as a key competitive driver in international markets for our food producers. Nevertheless, there are challenges ahead for food production systems globally, and no more so than here in Ireland, where 35% of all national greenhouse gas emissions come from the agri-food sector, accounting for a total of approximately 21 megaton of CO2 equivalents in the most recent full year EPA inventory in 2019. Whilst farmers have delivered much by way of efficiency gains in recent years, it must also be recognised that some environmental metrics have deteriorated on the back of recent dairy expansion. And it was in this context that I published a Climatize, or Climate and Air Roadmap out to 2030 late last year. And indeed, this was followed up this year then with the publication of our Food Vision 2030 strategy, and those two documents very much speak to each other. That new 10-year strategy for the sector, Food Vision 2030, it is a landmark one because it charts a course for how Ireland can become a world leader in sustainable food systems. And this means the sector being profitable throughout, having broad societal benefits, and having a positive or neutral impact on the environment. And it's worth noting that the strategy identifies being able to demonstrate sustainability in all its forms as a source of competitive advantage for agri-food. But it makes clear that if this is to be realised for the sector, along with government and society, there needs to be significant changes. And chief among these is the ambition to become climate neutral by 2050, with verifiable progress by 2030. Food Vision 2030 is about targeting increases in value added from agriculture and evolving and adjusting to a more sustainable way of farming that uses less inputs and relies instead on new technologies and new practices. Food Vision takes a systematic approach to addressing the challenge of ensuring that Ireland can continue to produce high quality food in a manner that protects the environment and also that mitigates climate change. Mission 1 of the strategy focuses solely on this, with 7 goals then across climate, biodiversity, water quality, forests, seafood, the circular bioeconomy, and origin green. Within these solutions are proposed then in the form of over 60 specific actions, with 10 of these on climate alone. And these include the full and immediate implementation of the acclimatized roadmap and updating that roadmap to ensure its consistency with new targets that will be set now for the sector under the Climate Action Plan 2021, which is expected to be published in the next short few weeks. Food Vision commits us to producing detailed plans to manage the sustainable environmental footprint of the dairy and beef sectors, rolling out carbon farming, dramatically increasing our research into mitigation technologies appropriate for our grassland livestock production system, playing a leading role in how emissions from livestock are understood and accounted, promoting regenerative agriculture, scaling up renewable energy, and focusing on energy efficiency and more besides. More specifically on methane, over the course of the decade, it's critical that technological solutions in the form of feed additives or methane vaccine are applied as well to ensure the sustainability of our grass-based production systems. We want to partner with like-minded countries globally, including the UK, to deliver this innovation, which will allow us to reduce the climate impact of our livestock. Farmers will be required to embrace new technologies such as low-emission slurry spreading machines for the application of organic manures back to land. And this is technology which will deliver a significant cut in ammonia emissions and put the sector well on its track to meet its commitments under the National Emissions Ceiling Directive. And we've seen significant movement in the last 2 or 3 years towards this, and it's something we're going to be stepping up dramatically in the time ahead. There is emerging demand for organically produced food, and Ireland is well placed to take advantage of this growing trend. Minister Pippa Hackett has direct responsibility for organic farming, and I was pleased with her to secure additional funds for organic farming in this year's budget. And this is very much just the beginning in this regard. On the land use side, it's very clear that we will need to plant more trees over the next 30 years to achieve our vision of a climate neutral sector. Current policy is to increase afforestation rates to 8,000 hectares per annum over the next decade. However, we will and may well need and will need to go beyond this level of planting. It's an undoubted challenge given current planting rates of approximately 3,000 hectares per annum. But my department has established a forestry review group to drive this agenda. And Minister Hackett and I are both determined to get this policy space right to allow our forestry planting levels to significantly increase in the time ahead. In addition, we will also need to manage many thousands of hectares of peat-based grassland soils. And these are soils that are currently a net emitter of carbon. And this is something we need to reverse and allow these soils to naturally lock up carbon. The new CAP will be important to drive the delivery of our environmental ambition, But I have been very clear with the farming organisations as well that CAP cannot do it all. All stakeholders will need to play their part, particularly industry players as well, who can drive behavioural change at farm level. We've already seen some of the great initiatives, such as some milk processors paying a milk price bonus for farmers that adopt certain biodiversity initiatives on their farms. This is the type of forward thinking that agri-food sector in Ireland really does need, whereby all actors in the food chain live up to their environmental responsibilities. So in conclusion, I'm excited about the future. This decade will be a decade of change for Irish agriculture, but producing high quality meat and milk protein will remain the bedrock of Ireland's agri-food industry. This is our key competitive advantage, and it would make no sense from an economic, environmental, or social perspective to move away from that. So just as we prepared for and adapted to the ending of milk quotas, we must now evolve and adjust to a more sustainable way of farming that uses less inputs and relies instead on new technologies and new practices. I look forward to working and continuing to work with stakeholders, both here in Ireland and abroad, in forging closer collaboration, particularly with our British counterparts in government, science, agri-tech, and beyond. Hopefully, today's event will contribute to that effort and be the first of many such dialogues. I'm delighted to see that the chair of the Food Vision Stakeholder Committee that developed the strategy, Tom Arnold, is on your panel later this morning. Tom will be able to provide a very valuable insight into the food vision process. And I wish you a constructive and fruitful engagement this morning. And I want to express my sincere thanks for you in asking me to speak at this event today. So thank you very, very much.
Always remember to come off mute when you're on a Zoom call. Many thanks, Minister, and thank you for your words and contribution this morning. I understand that you have to head away shortly. Would you be free for a question maybe from the audience? Paul, would you have a question that maybe the Minister might answer?
We've received one question, Minister, and again, I know you have to head off, but are there any plans for formal linkages between agricultural mitigation research in Ireland and the UK? Previously, there was an informal link between an Irish and UK agricultural project, but this ended as these projects were completed. So is there thoughts of a research collaboration in agri-tech mitigation?
I know it's something that our teams are engaging on to explore the opportunities that might be there. And I think it makes there's a lot of synergy, obviously, between our agricultural model in Ireland and indeed the agriculture in Britain. So I think there is real opportunity there, Paul, and it's something I do want to look to explore. Also, North-South, I've had a very strong relationship with Minister Edwin Poots as well in Northern Ireland. And we're exploring the options for collaboration there, and indeed around research too, and joint research ideas and investment, particularly around the area of carbon and how we can monitor and assess carbon and measure it, and then seek to monetize it in the way ahead, and indeed drive behavioural change and environmental delivery and emissions reductions at farm level too. And likewise in terms of the opportunity that's there between Britain and Ireland, that's something I'm very open to, and I know there is good engagement between our respective teams, and it's something I want to explore and deepen further in the time ahead.
And we will certainly, as a British Irish Chamber of Commerce, we certainly want to help you in that regard. One 10-second question, please, is just if you have any expectations for COP26.
Yeah, I do. I think COP in Paris was a really important moment in relation to the world signing up to their to targets, not all of which are being met, unfortunately, and really the ambition and the delivery has to be doubled down on in the time ahead. And I think COP26 is an important moment to note that. I think, the climate in the last year or two has given us many serious messages in relation to what's happening, and messages that we all must heed. And I think, it has been positive as well, though, to see the changing attitudes among the general public, and the average person, the average citizen, in relation to how this needs to be a key priority across all aspects of society. And, you know, the average person is demanding that of us as public policymakers, and is demanding that of everyone and every business and every organisation that they engage with now, more and more so. And I think that's an important driver as well in terms of ensuring that every country lives up to its obligations. That's something we do take seriously here, and that's something I take seriously in terms of our, you know, how Irish agri-food and agriculture can contribute to that and play our much needed role in relation to it. You know, because none more than farmers will be affected by, you know, a warming climate in the years ahead, and therefore must act with everyone across society to seek to prevent that happening, and to absolutely minimise the warming in the years ahead, because it will have a very serious impact. So I think COP26 will be an important moment in that regard, and certainly in the next week or two now, as I said in my contribution, we are coming forward with our own national climate action plan, which will be a significant update and uplift in ambition from where the 2019 action plan was at, where economy-wide by 2030, our objective is to deliver a 51% reduction in overall emissions, which is a significant target, and one we much all work to meet. And in advance of COP26, we will have expect published our national plans in terms of moving that forward. And, you know, from an agriculture and agri-food point of view, the point I make regularly to our farmers, and I'm currently visiting every county in the country as part of the process of finalising our national CAP plan, in line with to meet the European CAP plan, which we have to finalise by the end of this year. The point I'm making to farmers is, you know, not just relevant to agriculture, but to all aspects of production and the economy, that the way that we can be most strong in the years ahead as a food producing nation and as food producers is to ensure that we are as sustainable as we possibly can be, and to drive down our emissions, because that's an imperative from an environmental point of view, but it's also an imperative from an economic point of view, because consumers thankfully are becoming so aware now of the importance of what they consume and of their own behavior and how that impacts the environment around them, that they are seeking the validation and the evidence of what they're consuming, and that it actually meets the highest of environmental and sustainability standards. And in order for, and this is particularly important for agri-food, in order for us to be a really strong and vibrant sector in the time ahead, and strong as we possibly can, it's essential that we are world leading in terms of our sustainability, and we absolutely minimise and drive down our emissions. And I want to recognise again the work done by Tom Arnold and all involved in putting together Food Vision 2030 and that food systems approach, which will very much guide us on that journey.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you for indulging us for the last couple of questions, because I do know you have a meeting now, so thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And the words I hear always in these talks is collaboration. So really important that we collaborate internationally to find solutions to these problems. I think a shared problem is a halved problem, maybe, if I haven't butchered that expression. And also all of society. It's not one person. We can't point the finger at other people and say it's their problem. I think we all have a part to play in this. So that comes through in all of these seminars. So many thanks again, Minister. Really appreciate it. You're always a very busy man. So thank you for your time this morning. And we'll now pass on to Professor John Sweeney, who's a professor in the Department of Geography in Maynooth. And John leads the Irish Climate Change Analysis and Research Unit, the acronym ICARUS. So we're looking forward to talking to John. He has some strong views on the Irish government's climate action bill. So over to you, John, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Mark. I've actually retired from ICARUS for about 5 years, but I can't get a line then. But
you can leave, but I'm sorry, you're still connected.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yes, I wanted to follow from what some of the points the Minister was raising there, which I think are really quite relevant. He talked quite a lot about the need for preparation for what's coming down the line in terms of increasing environmental concerns about climate change. And I want to follow up on that and really pose the question, is Irish agriculture prepared to cope with what I think we can almost say is an incoming environmental tide? And we've all seen it over the past few years, indeed over the past few decades. And the question I suppose I'm asking here is, what kind of strategy are we going to adopt? I'm showing you King Canute here. King Canute put his chair on the sea and commanded the tide not to come in. That's at least the popular interpretation. I think it's a bit of a misrepresentation to what he actually did, as I'll come to in the end. But I think we have to ask the question, is Irish agriculture doing the same thing at the moment? Is it trying to prepare for the incoming tide by adapting, or is it in fact pretending to a large extent that these things can be avoided? Now, we're dealing, of course, with a very large, as the Minister said, a very important sector. Globally, agriculture accounts for about a quarter of global emissions. And of that quarter, you can see there's quite a lot of it contributed by livestock. About 14 or 15% of global emissions come from livestock. And if we look at the livestock and dairy industry as a whole, you can see up here the extent to which emissions and the carbon footprint arising from that industry is really enormous. If you take the top 20 meat and dairy companies, you can see their carbon footprint is equivalent to the total emissions virtually of the UK and France combined. That's quite a sobering thought, which makes us realize that this is an industry, this is an activity which we have to at least pay special attention to if we're to try and avoid the climate emergency overtaking us down the road. As the Minister said, agriculture in Ireland is even more important as a source of emissions, about 35% of those emissions. And as he hinted as well, we've seen those emissions rise quite steadily over the past 10 years or so. Irish agriculture was doing very well in the first decade of this century. It was showing a lot more sustainability and even declining emissions. But then, as we now know, with the withdrawal of the milk quota, things went into reverse. And the indications are that 2020 will have a further increase in agricultural emissions to report after a slight blip in 2019. As the Minister said as well, there are associated problems that have not yet been tackled. Ammonia, we've been non-compliant with the National Emissions Ceiling Directive for 7 of the past 9 years. And I think it's fairly inevitable that we will get some sort of kickback from Brussels fairly soon on that. And over the emissions in general of greenhouse gases, we now know how much we have failed to meet the emission reductions we signed up to over a decade ago. And we had to buy our way out of trouble on that. So the taxpayer is expected, has already found about 100 million euros to buy credits to comply with our requirements, and the taxpayer is expected to be finding 150 million to comply with our failure to meet our emissions obligations. So, you know, this is a very serious and a very costly issue. If we're paying 150 million, which we could ill afford, we could do a lot more with that than buying hot air elsewhere. The problem, of course, is the problem of increasing, especially dairy emissions. We know from the time of or even before the removal of the milk levy, we've seen a huge increase in milk production, 5,000 million litres or so being the norm for much of the end of the last decade and even the first decade of this century. Now going up from about 5 million to around about 8.3 billion litres at present. And that, of course, has been accompanied by an increase in the cattle herd. Not a dramatic increase overall, because some of the increase in dairy cattle is compensated for by decreases in other cattle. But nevertheless, we've seen in tandem an increase, especially in methane emissions, with the increase in dairy cows. There has been no decoupling whatsoever in terms of methane emissions and the increase in dairy cattle numbers. And on top of that, of course, as intensification has proceeded, we see that the average output per cow of methane has increased as well. The more inputs you put in, the more methane you produce. So we have this double whammy, if you like, of a huge increase in dairy cows, and also at the same time, each dairy cow emitting more in the way of methane. Where are they located? Well, they're located quite clearly, mainly in the south and southeast of the country. And you can see how much that corresponds to the areas of Ireland that we have nitrate problems. The Minister alluded to that as well. And we have nitrogen levels in our rivers, groundwater and estuaries in those areas which are too high, as the EPA have confirmed, and they're increasing primarily because of agricultural activities. There's no getting away from that. There's no whataboutery pointing to local authorities because they are operating quite happily in other parts of Ireland. The problem is quite clearly accentuated by intensive agriculture, dairying in the southeast of the country. So my concern really is that we're in danger of losing the clean green image on which the country depends in so many different ways. We've seen, if you like, a reduction in quality of our water, which has been huge in the past 30 or 40 years. We now have 21 or so pristine water courses left in Ireland. We had 570 at the end of the last 2 decades of the last century. And we've seen a lot of contamination of private water wells, of drinking water sources, even more recently, of course, and the emissions ceilings directive being exceeded from 2016 for ammonia, 99% of which comes from agriculture, as well as the exceedance of greenhouse gases. So where are we going? And unfortunately, if we ask where we're going and look at the sectoral roadmap from Teagasc, it looks like more of the same. The projections from the Teagasc roadmap for dairy suggest another 200,000 more cows in the next 7 years, milk outputs increasing further, the herd size increasing more. And that really is, I think, the question we have to ask about the direction of Irish agriculture this morning. Is it sustainable in terms of what's coming down the line, in terms of our environmental obligations? And the time for change in many ways, to my way of thinking, it was 10 years ago when we had Harvest 2020 and when there was no strategic environmental assessment allowed for that because it was deemed to come from the industry. We had Foodwise 2025, which makes no real figurative mention of the implications for greenhouse gas emissions. And we have the Agri-Food Strategy for 2030, which I'll come to as well. Now, the Agri-Food Strategy for 2030, as you all know, was one where the committee was dominated by industry interests, and where the environmental sector withdrew as a consequence of their feeling that this was the wrong direction that was being taken here. The document commits to a 10% reduction by 2030. Now, what the EPA Director General has said recently is that doesn't even meet the lower level of greenhouse reductions required under the 2019 plan. And the Minister has, of course, mentioned that that plan is now virtually obsolete, that we have to have more strict requirements. So this is going to need changing, radically changing, if we're to meet any of our obligations for the future. But it's interesting to actually pose the other question. Even within agriculture, a 10% reduction in methane would require a 77% reduction elsewhere in agriculture to achieve, for example, a 33% reduction overall. So there's going to be internal balancing in agriculture, which is going to be very contentious. And there's going to be a need, therefore, to look more closely at that. There is no get out of jail free card, I'm afraid. When you look at the IPCC's assessment report, you can see that there is no marginal differences between fossil origin methane and anthropogenic methane, as they class it there. The differences are really marginal and within the realms of experimental error. But what the IPCC do say is that countries must make strong, rapid and sustained reductions in methane emissions in addition to slashing CO2 emissions. And that's very important. That's putting, if you like, the onus back on agriculture to deliver those methane emissions that society wants. There is no alternative in terms of measuring methane in another way which works. We are obliged under the Paris Agreement to use the GWP 100 method for counting the equivalent of methane in carbon dioxide terms. And yes, while there are improvements in GWP star, which enable us to look at methane as a temperature influencer, the legal situation is still very clear there. There is also no get out of jail free card for removals and sequestration. The Minister talked about forestry, and yes, that is something that can be ramped up. But Irish land use at the moment is a source of CO2 equivalent emissions. And short-term removals are not cutting the mustard in terms of sequestration. You can't simply feed cattle perennial ryegrass fed nitrogen, consume that cattle, convert it to methane, and then emit it the next year. That's not sequestration. Long-term changes in soil carbon, yes, that is something that can qualify over a longer term. But carbon stays in the atmosphere for more than a century. We're not looking at things, therefore, which have an immediate effect in a short-term influence. Yes, I think we can also reward farmers, and I think we should, for maintaining the status quo or even improving the status quo, but they will not count necessarily as sequestration. And of course, we'll also have to count removals as well. And we also have to have an argument and a debate as to what taxpayer paid forest credits should actually go to in the first place. Now, going back to COP26 briefly, yes, it is being targeted as an issue in COP26. The United States and the EU have recently launched an initiative to diminish global emissions of methane by 30% by 2030. That's going to trickle down to Irish agriculture. It's going to be something that really will cause, I think, a reassessment of just what we can and can't do in the future. But what will really cause the reassessment, of course, will be the forthcoming carbon budgets and then sectoral budgets, which the Minister hinted we will get in the next few weeks. Just to give that a kind of a flavour, we are committed to 51% reductions by 2030. If agriculture gets a lighter ride, say of 33%, that means the burden on the rest of society is 60%. Any less and the burden on the rest of society becomes really unbearable in many respects. And here is where you run into problems of causing a rural-urban divide, which I don't want to see happening. I think this would be disastrous for the country if we start pitching farmers and agriculturalists against urban dwellers, against industry, against transport, against residential, and against waste. So we have a political problem there where, you know, we cannot have, if you like, a lighter load, substantially lighter for one sector at the expense of other parts of the economy. Farm incomes are good in dairy farming at the moment, as we know. It's probably going to be a record year. I think these figures that you see for dairying are very well merited. I think our dairy farmers really need that kind of income. We can see, by contrast, the way that beef farmers are really not making a living or a living wage. And that's a pity. I think we have lost those important beef farming sectors who look after biodiversity very well and look after that biodiversity, especially in the west of the country. And here's the real contrast in agriculture. If you look at the average cap payment, and this is rather old data, I know, but the picture is the same. East of the Shannon, the average cap payment is about twice that of west of the Shannon. That's really a big contrast. If you look at the dependency of farmers on Pillar 2, that is environmental schemes for the most part, you can see that up to 92% or more of farmers west of the Shannon are dependent on that payment, whereas east of the Shannon, the picture is maybe down to 1 in 3. That's the contrast that we have to tackle. And let's be honest, these are the people who are looking after biodiversity as well. And here we're looking at mostly the intensive farmers. So my argument today would be...
John,
yeah.
just to interrupt you, I'm afraid you're a little bit over time. So
yeah, okay.
sorry to have that uncomfortable task of pointing that out to you.
Can I just finish 1 minute now?
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, my argument would be today that the agricultural intensification model is bust. It's a busted flush at this stage, and we have to look at alternatives in terms of changing the course of Irish agriculture. And the reason I think we have to do that is because I believe in the fact that the Irish farming community is among the best we have in this world. They're the best stewards of rural Ireland. They're the backbone of rural Ireland, as the Minister said, and now they're ill prepared for what's coming down the line. They deserve much better leadership. And finally, of course, King Canute saw the light and moved his chair further up the beach. He adapted, he rolled with the tide, he saw what was coming, and I think Irish agriculture has to do the same. Thank you.
Many thanks, John. Always engaging in your talk. So many thanks for that. If I can now turn to Lucy Cronin, Senior Managing Partner of Instinctif Group, who's going to lead the panel discussion. Lucy, over to you.
Great, thanks, Mark, and good morning, everybody. Lots to think about there, I must say. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was very, very insightful, and no doubt the panelists will have thoughts on how to respond to some of the issues raised there. I mean, in the context of COP26, we know that the agri-food sector is one of the sectors that has been prioritized by that process. And we know that, the next couple of weeks will show us the direction the COP26 process has decided for the agri-food sector. What I'd like to get out of the panel discussion this morning is within the context of that process, that panelists can talk us through the changing nature of the agri-food sector, whether the targets that are set or targets that will be set are fair and achievable, what new innovations and technologies are available to the agri-food sector. And I think as well, I'd like to hear from the panel, what initiatives are required. The Minister has spoken about quite a few of them already this morning, to assist and aid the agri-food sector in climate policy development. We have a really good panel this morning. First and foremost, we have Tom Arnold, Chair of the Food Vision 2030 Strategy. We have Sam Fulton. Sam is the Group Director of Corporate Affairs, Nomad Foods. Nomad Foods is the largest frozen food company in Europe with brands such as Bird's Eye, Findus, Green Cuisine. Nomad operates in 22 countries and has plants in Naas and Longford. So you're very welcome, Sam, and thank you for joining us this morning. We're then very lucky to have Richard Kennedy, CEO Devonish Nutrition, which we all know is HQ'd in Belfast. Devonish Nutrition is a pretty fascinating company, in my opinion. It operates in over 50 countries, carrying out research and development in health and sustainability throughout the food chain. So you're very welcome, Richard. We then have Geraldine O'Sullivan, the Senior Policy Executive on the Environment for the Irish Farmers Association. Particular challenges well documented and indeed spoken about this morning for that sector. So we look forward to hearing from Geraldine. And then finally, Professor Sweeney is going to join us on the panel. So Tom, if I could turn to you first, please. I mean, the Minister set up my question, as did Professor Sweeney, in terms of the food vision process. So most of us on this call will be fairly familiar of what the objectives set down in the vision are. But can you talk us through how those objectives will actually be delivered?
Lucy. Okay, Lucy, thank you. I'm joining you from Brussels this morning. And up to now, I've been, the sound quality of everything that has gone up to now has been extremely poor. It's a very bad echo on the line for me.
Yeah, Tom, I think you have joined the call twice. I can see you have joined by phone maybe, and also, so you've joined twice. So maybe if you could have a quick look at that, and I'll just move on to Richard, and I'll come back to you, because I think you need to disconnect one of your connections to the event. I think that's
because I mean it's very unsatisfactory. I mean, I certainly can't hear you properly, and I suspect you can't hear me properly.
Yeah, there's definitely an echo, and I think it's because you've joined the call twice. Maybe Catherine could help Tom with that while I move along to Richard, if that's okay. Catherine, if you could just maybe help Tom with that. So Richard, we know that Devonish Nutrition has flourished on, you know, the collaboration that the company has with the research sector and with government agencies. And I saw that last month you entered into a partnership with Teagasc to help the Irish agri-food sector meet the climate challenges that have been spoken about this morning. Would you mind bringing us through that partnership? And really what I'm interested in here is how that type of partnership will help the agri-food sector achieve its objectives here.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Yes, you know, for us, I suppose, you talked about collaboration, and collaboration is key because I believe, and what was fundamental in developing that collaboration with Teagasc was that there's definitely a sense in the agriculture and food industry that there's a divide and diminish aspect. And we believe that there has to be a collaborate to accentuate. You know, what Professor Sweeney and the Minister said is very true. And I think the King Canute referenced by Professor Sweeney is very relevant. But my fear as somebody who's committed to Irish agriculture and food is that we don't pull the chair back from the edge. And maybe King Canute, at least he can see it coming. There is a sense in Irish food and agriculture that we see it coming, but we're not really prepared or willing to make those new steps and take those new steps to meet the challenge. But because it's a challenge, but it's also a crisis, and it's not just a climate crisis; it's a biodiversity crisis also. And we have many of the raw materials to deal with the challenges that are coming in Irish agriculture. But if we don't change, if we don't collaborate and step into that in a proactive way, we could very well be dragged out to sea, not dragged away from the sea. And I think that was the fundamental, that is the fundamental basis for our collaboration with Teagasc. We think it's very valuable. We think it's very important. We think it will mean that both organizations have the ability to challenge one another. But also there's going to be required some courage and determination here to change, to reimagine how we produce our food. Because as Professor Sweeney said, and as Minister McConalogue said, if we don't, then we continue to do, again to quote Einstein, continue to do the same things and expect a different outcome. You know, we're naive beyond belief. So for me, there's a huge opportunity for agriculture. There's a huge requirement for Irish agriculture and food to collaborate, to come together, to utilize the resources we have, and to deliver the most effective and efficient utilization of nutrients in the production of food, because that ultimately is what will deliver on our commitments from an Origin Green point of view, from our commitments as you know, as we commit and say that we are the most sustainable. Well, you know, we have to change what we've been doing, no question.
And just one additional point, and I think Tom has sorted out his line, so we'll go back to him after that, Richard. I know in the past that you have said that farmers and the wider agricultural sector have this unique opportunity through sequestration to deliver on decarbonisation. In your opinion, how do we make sure that that opportunity is actually realised? And why do you think it's such a unique opportunity?
Well, I suppose the research we've done in Doubt and with the variety of universities on the island shows that we have the correct environment, we have the ideal soils, the ideal climate to capitalize on very significant soil sequestration, but also. Tom Arnold's report points out the fact that we have only, I think it's 15 to 20% of the soils in Ireland are at optimum nutrient level. Soil must be healthy to sequester. So it's going to take significant changes. As Professor Sweeney said, we can't continue to use monocultures. We can't continue to simply ignore the inefficient utilization of nitrogen and nitrogen fertilizers and say and expect the soil to sequester without changing our practices. So as I say, it's going to take that very significant mind shift, a reimagination of how we farm and how we produce food. And I think, we have to call that out. We've been oblique in how we've suggested, we should move, we want to change. Now it's going to take real leadership, because the climate bill, the climate budgets are going to have massive impact. And it's very clear politically that those climate bills will be implemented. So, and as I said, the difficulty is for Irish farming and agriculture, we now need people to step up, be courageous, be determined, and say, we're going to change, because we can't continue to do what we've been doing.
Thanks, Richard. And Tom, that brings me back, I suppose, to the question that I'd have for you and the Minister outlined, and I hope you can hear me properly now. In terms of the Food Vision 2030 process, so how do we go from the objectives set down in the strategy to the actual, tracking and achieving of those objectives? Can you hear me, Tom?
I think I got most of that question, Lucy, but I'm it over. But you're really asking, I think, how does the 2030 strategy begin in a different direction? Is that essentially it?
That's it, yeah.
Okay. Well, part of the answer to that is that I think there was very clear recognition that there had to be a major shift. The previous strategy, Foodwise 2025, promised a lot on the environment and frankly didn't deliver. And didn't deliver largely because of the factors that John Sweeney outlined, the very substantial increase in the dairy herd and the consequential environmental effects of that. But what this strategy, 2030 strategy, represents, in my view, is a very clear statement of intent for the next decade, with a central policy objective that Ireland succeeds in becoming a leader in sustainable food systems. And we have a set we put forward a set of policy measures aimed at achieving that. It's also clear that the targets that are set in 2030 are targets that are going to have to be adjusted in light of other decisions that have, and it's specifically said in text, in the light of other decisions at national and international level. And the first example of that is going to be decisions on carbon budgets, which are going to have very significant impacts. The sector is faced with a very significant challenge of change over the coming years. We would like that change to be based on certain principles, that it's achievable, that it brings people along with the change process, that it's the principle of just transition comes into play, and that the basic, if we're talking about sustainability, that we do recognize that it has three dimensions: economic, environmental, and social. And that's the underlying thinking that is set in our strategy. That means that at a high strategic level, there are decisions from that, the everyday decisions, which can be very difficult. And an example of that is going to be what's going to be the outcome of the process currently underway to deal with the Nitrates directive, because that is going to directly impact on the question of soil water quality. And for me, water quality is certainly a non-negotiable issue. We are going to have to set down on a pathway to improve water quality and to understand the consequences that will have for farming practice and for various other forms of dealing with the water issue. But I mean, I think the direction is set. That's the real significance of this document. And it is going to be then up to obviously governments and people who are, other stakeholders to see how we translate, how we achieve these bigger strategic goals and via a lot of, if you like, decisions that are going to have to be taken along the way. But certainly, that is going to require a very large amount of change at farming level, and not just at farming level. I mean, the whole point of the approach we've used in this strategy is what we call a food systems approach, which means that everyone along the food chain has their role to play. So that's the vision that we've set. I did say in my foreword to this document that I felt that on the specific issue of the agri-environment, we had got to a place in this country where there's a level of excessive division, and we need to start working to reduce that and find common ground between the agricultural and the environmental interests. Just a bit on that towards the end. And I felt that what we were putting forward was a suite of policy directions in 2030 provided the basis for finding that sense of common ground. We've a bit to go yet to achieve it, but I think that was certainly a core intent in writing this document. I leave it at that.
Great, thanks, Tom, and my apologies to everybody for the poor quality of the line. We are trying to fix it. But Tom mentioned, all stakeholders playing their part, which, brings me beautifully to Nomad Foods, because Nomad Foods is a real example of a company that has taken a leadership role, not just in tackling climate change, but very recently by signing the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But Sam, you also not only have signed up to that initiative, but you also have committed as a company to cutting your food loss and food waste by half by 2030. So can you explain to us how a company like Nomad Foods can transform itself to get itself to a place not only to sign the SBTI, but also to make that level of commitment in terms of your 2030 commitments? You're on mute, Sam.
Sorry, I thought I had actually come off mute. Apologies. I think the first point that's really key on this is actually, especially signing up to SBTI, the science-based targets, that this actually builds on years and years of work that we've actually previously done. So it really links back to our company purpose. So the company purpose for Nomad Foods is around serving the world with better food. That's got two specific angles. It means we need to provide consumers with food that's nutritious, but also we want to increasingly provide consumers with choices that mean that their food is better for the planet. And that's across all of our supply chain. So our biggest categories are fish, veg, and increasingly plant protein. And I think for the purposes of this call, if we look specifically at agriculture and our veg supply chains, in some of our biggest markets, so UK and Germany, for example, we've actually worked with some of the farmers in those markets for decades, 20 plus years. What that's actually meant is there's been a continual focus on how do we increasingly farm or help them to farm sustainably. How do we make sure that every single farmer and every single farm has got an agricultural action plan? And then especially over the last few years, how do we actually really start to dig into areas that are becoming bigger and bigger concerns? So for example, biodiversity loss, and areas such as regenerative agriculture. So, some good examples that we've got actually, some of the stuff that Richard talked around carbon sequestration. So we've done some really interesting pilot projects on pea production, for example, where by using cover crops between the pea crop, you can actually sequester significant amounts of carbon. So quite innovative work. Some of it actually, as I said, building on work that happened decades ago. And then what we've done this year is actually sign a partnership with WWF, and the purpose of that partnership is to take some of the stuff that we're already doing, take it to another level, but more importantly, actually take it outside of our supply chain. So basically make sure that we've got a bigger impact, just outside the farms that we actually work with. Because of that work, we have actually been reporting for a number of years. So we've reported on how we actually source. We also report and increasingly have started to report on things like food waste, to your earlier point. But the real focus going forward is how do we actually drive faster progress? So how can we actually accelerate our journey to decarbonize the business? So in terms of food waste, we actually signed up to 10-20-30, which is a big global initiative. It involves food manufacturers. It involves a lot of retailers, people like Tesco's, for example. The whole objective of that program is to have food waste by 2030. So again, much more aggressive targets than maybe previously. And then in terms of SBTI and our emissions targets in particular, this year we actually had our targets approved by SBTI. The important thing is actually, like other companies, that we're on a journey to net zero well before 2050. But actually what we're trying to do is make sure that we're driving immediate action. There's a lot of, I think, focus in the marketplace around greenwashing and delaying action. So what we've actually done is put in place some really aggressive 2025 milestones. So by 2025, we'll actually almost have emissions per ton of product produced. And then probably most importantly, also by 2025, we're going to ensure that the top 75% of our suppliers by emissions also put in place science-based targets. So, I think the points that John and Richard made really illustrate that, whether it's businesses, farmers, governments, whoever, we're actually all part of this really interconnected ecosystem. So I think the point is that all of us need to step up. So it's really important as we go forward and kind of, face the challenge of net zero, that we actually take our supply chain with us, really.
And I think I'm assuming some of the companies on the call this morning would be, who are not as advanced as Nomad Foods in terms of the pathway and the journey that you're taking as a company. Do you have any pearls of wisdom for companies who might be, behind in terms of this pathway, as to what is the key to progress and success of a company in order to make those commitments and deliver on the commitments, such as Nomad Foods has done and is in the process of doing?
I mean, I think probably that the learnings that our internal experts would share is the fact that you've got to get data to start the process. And actually, I think their feedback has been that you need to be really realistic about how long that might actually take, because it requires working across your own business. It might require data from other sources. So I think having a realistic timeline on the data collection piece is really key. But the data is essential to the next stages, because it gives you insight into where you can actually, potentially make savings. For us, for example, we actually learned that stuff like waste segregation had a much bigger impact than we actually realized. So there are some really good learnings you get from the data process. And I think, again, they would say that you've got to ask for help. We're a pretty big company. We had actually been doing some of this stuff for several years, but actually we worked with an external organization called Carbon Intelligence. We realized that we actually needed help to set targets that were going to be ambitious enough and that were actually credible. We realized we needed help to actually navigate the actual SBTI application and kind of approval process. So I think asking for help, and I think for SMEs, probably trade associations are a really good source of information. A lot of the trade associations in the sector organizations are putting in place, templates. They're running seminars on how to actually approach getting to net zero. So I think genuinely just really ask people who've done it before for help, because they're generally really happy to provide guidance. And then I think the next thing is really, a bit like John emphasized. I mean, the stats on this are clear. The science is indisputable. So you've got to see this as something that's essential for business success. It's not just a sustainability campaign. It's something that actually needs to drive your business for the future, and it can genuinely drive efficiencies and savings. So it's important to do.
Great, thanks, Sam. Professor Sweeney, just obviously Nomad Foods is a good example of the type of things you would want to see from a company. I'd be interested in your view on whether you feel that the agri-food sector in the UK, if you can, but obviously also in Ireland, has responded sufficiently to the climate challenge. In other words, are you seeing the types of programs that Sam just spoke about, are you seeing those across the sector, or is this sort of an example of what could be done but too few are doing it?
Yes, I think, there is a difference between the sample we have today, which I've really enjoyed listening to, and I think have been good examples of best practice in many respects in the sector. But, it's not something that's universal yet, and it's something that has to become universal if we're to address the challenges that we've been talking about. I think there's a number of things that we really need to think about in terms of we are much more dependent on agriculture in Ireland than the UK. That's the first issue. There is much more in the way, therefore, of political clout that can be exercised in Ireland than is the case in the UK. And there are a few things that I think the agri-sector might well think about more seriously in the future. The first one really, I suppose, is that, there is a need, especially now, for companies to look not just at Scope 1 emissions, but to look at the emissions across their supply chain. Many industrial companies are now doing this, and they're looking at Scope 3. And I think, by looking at Scope 3, that is the supply chain for agriculture, both in Ireland and the UK, there will be a greater sense of responsibility imbued on the companies themselves. And I think that takes some of the weight, if you like, and responsibility off the farmer, who I think has borne the brunt of the problem so far. And I think, once we start bringing that weight of responsibility a bit more onto the company shoulders, then there are options. And we've seen a few of those options today where, for example, companies can reward sustainable farmers. I would like to see some companies following that model and, for example, rewarding farmers who are conducting these eco schemes, taking part in having more than the 4% minimum, if you like, of eco area in their farms, who are developing ponds, who are doing a lot of good things under Pillar 2. I think they should be rewarded and not necessarily penalised, and that should come from the profits of the large food companies themselves. And we have some very large multinationals, both in Ireland and the UK, who I think could well afford to actually use some of that largesse in recognising the hardship that farmers have, because farmers are not making a living in many cases. Farmers are below the breadline in terms of beef, for example, in particular, and they've got themselves into debt in huge quantities on the basis of a direction of travel which is now going to prove almost impossible to continue. The other thing I think we have to start thinking about is not using spurious arguments anymore. The arguments about leakage, for example, they don't cut the mustard, quite honestly. Once we start going down that road and pointing fingers at other countries, we open up that whole area for other countries to do the same to us, firstly. We can have Germany saying they make cars far more efficiently than France, for example, and therefore there's leakage involved. You have a whole can of worms. But the bottom line is we're all responsible for our national emissions only. We can't start looking at excuses by looking at other countries failing. So we have to solve the problem ourselves. That's the most important thing, I think, of all. And we need to look at whether or not some of our export markets are really ethical as well. I mean, should we be exporting baby formula to Chinese mothers, for example, is an issue that I think I've often had worries about as well. So there are areas where I think we can change the way we're going, change the system. I was very happy to hear Richard's comments as well about the sort of the need for a radical change in direction, because, you know, aspirations and plans are fine, but we haven't got the time. We have 10 years before we hit the 1.5 degree threshold. And at that point, we tip climate in many parts of the world potentially into very unstable areas. So we haven't got the time for a 2030 thinking about plan that doesn't get really implemented until 2026 or 2027. We have to actually do things now, and that means very hard decisions, as the Minister hinted at, to comply with the law. Because make no mistake, if we don't comply with the law in the agricultural sector, we will end up in court over it. So, you know, it's something that there is no option and we can't run away from any longer.
Thanks. Tom, if you would keep your camera off, because I'm hoping that the line will work properly, just on the point about the measurement of the success, which Professor Sweeney just spoke about. What are the plans around measurement of the delivery of Food Vision 2030? If you could just keep your camera off and take yourself off mute.
There are detailed monitoring and implementation plans associated with Vision 2030. And one of the learnings from the previous exercise, where things were not done as they were projected to be done, is there should be a specialized subcommittee on the agri-environment side, so that early detection, if there were to be, if again there was to be the data were to show that we were not on track for what we indicated we wanted to be on the track we indicated we wanted to be on, that would be detected early and measures taken to deal with that. So I think the whole business of the whole business of monitoring and the implementation of what we have committed to do is of absolutely central importance, and I think is going to feature much more strongly in respect of Food Vision 2030 than on any previous plan.
Thanks, Tom. Richard, I'm conscious that you put your hand up, but I just want to go to Geraldine first, if that's okay, and then I'll come back to you. Geraldine, good morning. You know, I was going to talk to you about the Lancet article, but I think on the back of Professor Sweeney's presentation, I don't need to. I guess the question that one of the questions I have for you, Geraldine, is, you know, what is the view of the IFA in terms of the supports that farmers are receiving or should be receiving in order to make the climate transition? I mean, Sam referenced, you know, the importance of rewarding sustainable farmers, as did Professor Sweeney. And I think it would be interesting for us to know, you know, what is being provided to the sector in terms of supports and what's lacking.
Thanks, Lucy, very much for the question. And as been said, a very interesting conversation here this morning. I suppose we would have concerns about, like, as was pointed out by Professor Sweeney, you know, the dairy sector is doing well, but only a third of farms are considered economically viable. So when you're asking such transformative changes, or as outlined in Acclimatize and as outlined in the Agri-Food Strategy, that represents a significant challenge, because as we all know, we have 140,000 family farms. They're individual businesses. So for them, when you are financially struggling, it is very difficult to think outside the box. It's very difficult to be innovative. It's very difficult to take a risk and change practices. And as everyone has rightly said, this requires people to change their business practices, to change how they manage and to make investments in it. So we don't see the supports there at the moment to allow that transition. We see the cap and we see a reduction in the direct payments, and where their money will go to the eco schemes, it will go into compliance and will not be real income. So we actually see that vulnerability of farms potentially increasing. So that's a real worry for us under the new CAP programme. We welcome the changes, and we welcome the fact that we are moving and transitioning into this. But in real terms, the income and the direct payments to a lot of these farm families will be reduced. You know, we saw there in the budget last week that the carbon tax, which had been earmarked that was going to go towards agri-environmental schemes, has not been directed to the agri-environmental schemes. And that's worrying because, as everyone has said here this morning, we need to start the process now. You know, this is hugely, I can't remember, was it the minister or we were talking about behavioural change, and that is what's required. It is going to be change, behavioural change, and also transitioning. If you look at what they're doing in Devonish and what Richard is doing there, it takes a number of years for that soil fertility, for that change to take place. So we need the investments now. 10 years is a very short time. We need to see, you know, there are opportunities here, as was said, through carbon farming and incentivizing change, but we haven't seen those mechanisms. So we need investment, we need to reduce our emissions, but we need to see how we don't have an alternative income stream here. And look, we welcome the discussions and the talk, I suppose, within the strategy of the agri-food and within the wider EU of fairer food systems, you know, but we have yet to see that fair and how that distribution is going to be fairer and how farmers are going to get their fair share, because this has been promised in the past and hasn't materialized. And there is a grave concern among farmers that they're going to foot this bill. They're not in a position to do it. And you know, that it will, you know, we have a great family farm model here in this country that we should be protecting. As we've said, has been repeated, it is the backbone of our rural economy, and we need to protect that, but we need to provide understanding of how this is going to be funded, and we haven't seen that clarity yet.
So I suppose my only challenge there, Geraldine, is, you know, the state can play a role, the private sector in terms of, you know, the entities to whom the farmers are supplying product can play their role as well, and I think there's recognition on the call this morning that is absolutely how it should be. I suppose my challenge in all of this, though, is, you know, it is not just a matter of you know, farmers receiving support. They also have, you know, to play their own part. So what I'd be interested to hear from you is, you know, what is it that an individual farmer can do himself or herself to play their own part in all of this?
Look, there's lots that is ongoing at the moment in relation to, like, if you take even looking at emissions about what has gone on within the sector, and like Professor Sweeney showed an increase, but the reality here is agriculture is at the same level of emissions as in and around 1995. And we've seen a 40% increase in production. So we have seen those efficiencies. We've seen huge investment over the last while, be it in low emission slurry spreading equipment, switching to protected urea, you know, planting of multi-species swards. We're seeing that, but we do need to get a clear message. As was rightly said, you know, this is really a transformative strategy, and we need to get the clear messages to farmers, and that's what they're looking for. They're looking to make changes. They know the challenge is there, and they will make those changes. Ourselves, we're working through smart farming with the EPA, where we're looking at resource efficiency, opportunities where we can identify cost savings through soil fertility, grassland management, and improving that so that there isn't a cost involved, but you are seeing an increase in your profitability and improving of resources. So there is a lot going on, Lucy, at farm level as well.
Great, thanks, Geraldine. Now, I'm conscious of time, 11:23. So, Richard, unless you have a burning desire to come back in right now, I think I might throw the Q&A out to the floor at this point. Yeah, Richard's okay. So, Paul.
Thanks, Lucy. Quite a number of questions have come in, and I suppose I'll start with the one that's maybe most topical, and then I'll come back with a couple more, which is, what are the panel hoping will come out of COP26?
Can I give that to Sam first, and then maybe Professor Sweeney?
Okay, so I mean, I think the first thing, and in some ways it's kind of done the job that it needed to do already, in the sense that it's actually put climate change and the whole climate debate really in the spotlight. I think it will be hard to argue that it's not accelerated some of the discussions. And I mean, even, I'm not sure what it's like in Ireland, but in the UK, we're seeing almost on a daily basis companies coming through with science-based targets, you know, really credible stretching targets in advance of COP. So it's starting to drive momentum. I mean, John may disagree. I think there are questions as to what actually will come out of COP. And in fact, I think a lot of the discussion is we need to wait and see. But we're just hoping that, I think, you know, that there's probably, you know, clear action from governments, really. I mean, business can play a role, but in terms of the climate debate, the governments really have got to play a key role, because that I think is where there's a lack of clarity in some areas.
Thanks, Sam. John?
Yes, I would agree with a lot of what Sam said there. The COP, I would temper expectations as to what's going to come out of this. I mean, the build-up has been remarkably similar, in my view, to what I experienced at Copenhagen in 2009. And this is I think I'm going to my 10th COP. And really, it's only when you get there you realize that our perspectives are not necessarily shared by the hard-boiled negotiators that are there from other countries. So, you know, I'm very hopeful that we will, first of all, get an agreement on the rule book for Paris, which still hasn't actually been finalized. And that will certainly involve carbon trading and what we give credit for in terms of especially forestry credits from the developing countries, especially Brazil. That's going to be a crunch. And also, of course, the relationship between the United States and China. I think we have to see how that's going to materialize over the next 2 weeks. That will be crucial in terms of the COP itself, because so far China has not supplied its new nationally determined contribution to the COP. And there are concerns that they will not up the game that they pledged to do at Paris. So I've watched China and India, certainly, and they, of course, are very much in the vanguard of total emissions. From an agricultural point of view, I know that Ireland will be very close to New Zealand in terms of attending each other's functions. And they have many similar problems. New Zealand, for example, has also had the water quality deterioration that we have had here in Ireland. So maybe we can learn a little from each other as to what we did wrong in terms of the whole thing. I will also expect to see increased effort from Ireland coming, especially in methane. I think I will be very fascinated to see if Ireland signs up to the 30% methane pledge, which the EU has indicated it will sign up to. So I'll be listening very closely to Frans Timmermans on that to see to what extent Ireland will be going down that road, or playing the role of laggard as we've played so often in the past. But I think, you know, there's no doubt that methane is now identified from the IPCC report as the #1 target to avoid dangerous climate change. It's the quick fix. Because it only lasts in the atmosphere 11 years, it has 85 times the heating capability of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. So if we want to avoid the cliff, if we want to stop being lemmings, then we have to tackle methane first. And that will mean that agriculture will be the focus of COP26 in many respects. So I think that's the key thing that I would hope to see progress made in.
Great, thank you. Paul?
Okay, yeah. One of the questions is, I suppose generally, is what lessons we can learn from other countries. What country's modern agri-food strategy has impressed you the most? what lessons could Ireland learn? And then there's one specifically for Sam, which is, has the UK agri-food sector been appropriately supported by the UK government to ensure just transition? And then a final, maybe I'll link the three together actually, and then that could be us. How important is trade policy to the just transition?
So if I could just, Richard, if you, given the fact that you're active in 55 countries, maybe you could sort of give us your view on learnings and initiatives in other countries that you've come across.
Well, I think in general across the world, it's a similar story. You know, my sense is that Ireland should be and could be a leader in this, and the UK. You know, when I talk about Ireland, I talk about Ireland as being part of the supply chain, because you know, the UK is a key part of that supply chain and the outlet. But I think, you know, the UK and Ireland have the potential to be absolute leaders. And you know, as I just wanted, the comment I wanted to make earlier was around the fact that, you know, Irish farmers have an opportunity around Scope 3, as John says, and that's key. So there is in other countries there is certainly more impact. There are multinationals and foreign direct investment in Ireland that have commitments in their home countries that are going to impact here. And as I said, everybody is now saying there's no other game in town. I think two things that are driving a common theme across all that, are driving a common momentum across that, are the actions of the likes of the ECB, who have, you know, and the EU, who have set out the Green Deal goals, but most importantly, the impact that the ECB has had now on ESG investment. So, you know, it's very important for companies to realize that, and we're seeing this across the world, companies are realizing that there's going to be a liability on their balance sheet for damage they will do to the environment. When will it come home and to roost? So where is the liability? And the liability will land, because if we don't meet the requirements, as Professor Sweeney said, then there's a real challenge. So across the world, we're seeing a ferocious momentum and an incredible shift. I was speaking to a senior executive from an Australian, very large Australian multinational, and he was saying that you know, he expects changes in the food industry that are unprecedented in the next 5 years. Thanks,
Richard. I'm going to hand back over to Mark in a minute or two, but Sam, if you could just answer the question with respect to the UK, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'll keep it really quick. I know we're pushed for time. So I think farmers would probably say that they'd always want more support from government, but I think the reality is, as we've just talked about, you know, to drive the level of change that's necessary actually needs collaboration. So government intervention on its own won't do it. So I think our position, and probably the position from a lot of the farmers that we work with, is that the most successful outcomes are when you get that really strong collaboration, because everybody's got a role to play, really. And that's where I think, as I said earlier, everybody needs to step up, including government. But I don't think government on its own can drive the change that's needed.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, with that, Mark, I'm going to hand over to you.
Many thanks, Lucy, and a great panel session, and indeed great talks from Professor Sweeney and Minister McConalogue. I didn't think I'd be talking about the C and the letter C so much in the wrap up, but certainly King Canute gives, and the analogy of King Canute gives a great example of what we're facing, and we simply can't turn back the tide of climate change. So we really do need, it's a call for action. What I heard today, lots of C words. I heard from Professor Sweeney about collaboration, and indeed we just heard it from Sam there. There's a challenge. But also Richard Kennedy spoke about the courage to change. And I think that's really important. I was taken by Geraldine's point on that 1/3 of farm families are, or sorry, 1/3 of farms are economically viable. And there's a risk to change practices. But that requires, again, we talk about behavioral change. And really what I was interested when Tom Tom spoke about. And I think this is really important, and I hope we go back to these sessions again about finding common ground between the environmental lobby and the agricultural sector, so they work together to drive that change, because there is an urgency. And then Sam talked about consumer choices, and they hopefully will provide change and provide consumers with choices to make that might result in a better planet. But also, I was taken from Sam about not just thinking 2030 is far away. She talked about 2025 targets and the need to drive faster progress. And again, that C word, connected ecosystems. We're all in this together through supply chains, through society. It was an excellent point. So I think, and then sorry, Professor Sweeney as well, with those low income farms, it's hard to get beyond survival. So those large food companies rewarding farmers for taking sustainability initiatives. So, and on all of this, I think Richard finished off with a radical change in direction. So lots of collaboration, change, common ground, consumer choices, all those C words, and finally King Canut who on the C. So really just finally to thank Minister McConalogue, Professor John Sweeney, all our panelists who I won't name individually, but thank you. And particularly to Lucy as senior partner to Instinctif Partners, who've led this and been the champions for this series of talks with the British Irish Chamber. So thank you very much, Lucy, to you as well. And as always, thank you to Paul and Catherine, who always run a fantastic show for the Chamber of Commerce. So thank you all. And of course, thank you to all those who attended this morning. It's been an excellent session, and thank you for your participation in it.
Thank you to you, Mark. So thank you, everybody.
All right, and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.